When I decided to take a solo RV trip into the heart of Wyoming's vast wilderness, I thought it would be a peaceful getaway. But then I met a man named Cole. He seemed friendly, helpful even, but I didn't know his real name or the dark secrets he was hiding. By the time I found out, it was almost too late to escape. What would you do if the person you trusted on your camping trip turned out to be a killer? Stay tuned for the full story of Cole's deception. And if you enjoy gripping tales like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It all started as a desperate escape. My name is Evan Sanders, and for months, I'd been stuck in a grind that seemed endless. Long hours at work, nights filled with emails, and days where my only peace was imagining someplace far, far away. By the time I made the decision to pack up my RV and hit the road, it felt less like a choice and more like a necessity. My destination? Shoshone National Forest in Wyoming, a sprawling wilderness that promised solitude and a chance to reset. The drive alone was worth it. Endless stretches of towering pines bordered the winding dirt roads, and the air grew crisper the further I got from the city. By the time I reached my campsite, the late afternoon sun was casting long golden rays through the trees, making the entire forest seem to glow. I parked my RV in a secluded clearing near a gentle creek. It was the kind of place that seemed untouched by time, where silence wasn't eerie but peaceful. The only sounds were the rustling leaves in the breeze, and the occasional chirp of a bird. This was exactly what I needed, a break from the chaos. Setting up camp was easy. I unfolded my chair near the fire pit, set a small pot of coffee to brew, and let myself relax for the first time in months. Sitting there with the smell of pine in the air and the faint sound of water trickling nearby, I felt the weight of my old life start to lift. As the sun dipped lower, I wandered down to the creek to wash up and snap a few pictures. The light was perfect, golden reflections bouncing off the water. I couldn't help but feel grateful for this moment, thinking that maybe, just maybe, I'd made the right choice coming here alone. That's when I noticed him. A man emerged from the tree line, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path as he approached. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sandy blonde hair peeking out from under a worn baseball cap. He carried himself with an easy confidence, the kind of person who seemed completely at home in the wilderness. "Hey there," he called out, raising a hand in greeting. "Nice setup you've got here." I hesitated for a second. Being alone had been the whole point of this trip after all. But his friendly tone eased my nerves. "Thanks," I replied, wiping my hands on my jeans. "You camping nearby?" "Yeah, just over the ridge," he said, gesturing behind him. "Figured I'd say hi. I'm Cole." He extended a hand and I shook it. "Evan, nice to meet you." And just like that, the first piece of my peaceful getaway fell into place, or so I thought. Cole seemed like the kind of guy you'd want around in the wilderness. He had a rugged look about him. His flannel shirt and cargo pants were well worn, and his hiking boots had clearly seen some miles. He carried a sturdy-looking backpack slung over one shoulder, complete with carabiners and a water bottle strapped to the sides. It was like meeting a character straight out of a survival show. "Mind if I hang out for a bit?" he asked, nodding toward the campfire I had just started. "Sure," I said, gesturing to one of the foldable chairs I'd set up. We fell into an easy conversation. He talked about how he'd been traveling across the country for months, hopping from one campsite to another. He claimed he'd worked construction jobs in small towns to fund his trips, but he never seemed to stay in one place for long. "It's the freedom I love," he said, leaning back in the chair. "No one telling me where to go, no deadlines, no expectations, just me and the road." I nodded, relating to the appeal of leaving everything behind. But as he spoke, something about him felt off. Not in a glaringly obvious. He was charismatic, and his stories were interesting, but there was a vagueness to his details. He'd mention a town he'd passed through but couldn't name the exact highway he'd taken. Or he'd describe a camping trip from a few weeks ago, but mix up whether it was in Colorado or Montana. Still, I chalked it up to harmless inconsistencies. Maybe he was just bad with specifics, I thought. Everyone's got their quirks. The sun had almost completely set by the time Cole stood up and stretched. "Well, guess I should get back to my site before it's pitch black," he said, adjusting his cap. "Where are you camped?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Just over that ridge," he said again, pointing vaguely toward the east. "If you need anything, feel free to holler." With a casual wave, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone with the crackling fire. I stared at the flames for a while, sipping my coffee and letting the stillness of the forest wrap around me. But as the minutes passed, I realized I wasn't entirely at ease. I couldn't pinpoint it, but something about Cole stuck in my mind. Maybe it was his vague answers, or the fact that he'd been so quick to strike up a conversation with a total stranger. Or maybe it was just my overactive imagination. I shook my head, brushing off the feeling. After all, I was out here to escape my own overthinking, wasn't I? Still, as I crawled into my sleeping bag later that night, I made a mental note to keep an eye on Cole if he came around again. The forest was quiet, and the fire outside had burned down to glowing embers. But even with the serene setting, it took me longer than usual to fall asleep. The next morning, the forest was alive with the sounds of birds chirping and the faint rustle of leaves in the cool breeze. It felt good to wake up with the sun peeking through the trees, casting soft rays of light across my RV. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee on my camp stove and sat outside, soaking in the solitude I'd been craving. But solitude didn't last long. As I was finishing my coffee, Cole appeared again, walking toward my campsite with a casual wave. He looked freshly showered, though I couldn't figure out where he might have cleaned up out here. There weren't any facilities nearby, not for miles. "Morning," he called out. "Hope I'm not bothering you." I forced a polite smile. "Not at all. Coffee?" I offered, holding up the pot. "Nah, I'm good," he said, taking a seat in the same foldable chair he'd used the night before. "Figured I'd swing by and see if you wanted to hike today. There's this great trail not too far from here. Leads to a ridge with an amazing view of the valley." The suggestion caught me off guard. I hadn't planned on hiking with anyone, let alone someone I just met. But at the same time, I didn't want to come off as rude or paranoid. "Sure," I said hesitantly. "Let me grab my gear." We set off about 20 minutes later, following a narrow dirt trail that snaked through the forest. At first the hike was pleasant. The air was crisp, and the trees towered above us like sentinels. Cole led the way, chatting about random topics, how he'd once fixed a cabin roof in exchange for a week's stay, or how he'd camped out in the Rocky Mountains during a snowstorm. But as the hike went on, the unease I'd felt the night before started creeping back in. For one thing, Cole never seemed to run out of stories. At first it was entertaining, but after a while it felt like he was trying too hard to fill the silence. And some of his stories contradicted what he'd told me earlier. He'd mentioned traveling through Wyoming as if it were a recent trip. But hadn't he said yesterday that he'd been in Idaho just a week ago? I tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe he was just a little scatterbrained. But then there was the... He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if checking to see if we were being followed. "Everything okay?" I finally asked. He looked back at me and grinned, but the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, of course. Just making sure we're still on the trail." I nodded, but the excuse didn't sit right with me. The trail was clear, and there was no way we could have gotten lost. By the time we reached the ridge, the view of the valley below should have been breathtaking. but all I could think about was how much I wanted to head back to camp. As the crackling campfire cast eerie shadows on my RV, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, I heard Cole outside. His voice was low, angry. "No, listen to me. He doesn't suspect anything," he hissed. The words sent a chill down my spine. I peeked out the window and saw him pacing near his tent, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight. My heart, what was he hiding? And more importantly, what had I just stumbled into? That moment, I realized I wasn't just out here for a peaceful getaway anymore. I was in the middle of something dangerous. And the worst part? I had no idea how far it would go. What would you do if you overheard something like this in the middle of nowhere? Let me know in the comments and stick around. Things are about to get terrifying. When we got back to camp after the hike, I felt drained, but not from the physical exertion. Something about Cole's constant chatter and the way he kept glancing over his shoulder had left me on edge. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just nervous about being out in the wilderness, or maybe he didn't get to talk to people much. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Cole didn't seem to notice my unease. Instead, he plopped down by my fire pit like he belonged there, cracking open a soda from his backpack. "You've got a good setup here," he said, gesturing toward my RV. "Better than my tent for sure. You must camp a lot." "Not as much as I'd like," I admitted, poking at the embers in the fire pit with a stick. "You mind if I charge my phone in your RV?" he asked casually. "Mine's dead, and I've got some folks I need to check in with." The request took me by surprise. I wasn't one to let people I barely knew into my space, but he said it so nonchalantly that it almost felt rude to say no. "Sure," I said reluctantly, getting up to unlock the door. He followed me inside, looking around as if taking inventory of my setup. "Nice ride," he said, running a hand over the counter. "Thanks," I replied, plugging in his phone and setting it on the small dining table. I stood there awkwardly for a moment, watching as he glanced around. "Looks cozy," he said, flashing me a grin that didn't quite meet his eyes. "Yep," I replied shortly, hoping he'd take the hint. He didn't linger long, thankfully, and soon he was back outside, phone in hand. I stayed behind, pretending to clean up just to give myself a little distance. Something about the way he moved through my RV, like he was cataloging everything he saw, made my skin crawl. That night, I decided to lock my RV's door before bed, a habit I'd always been lax about on solo trips. I told myself it was just because I was in a new area, not because of Cole. Still, I double-checked the lock and pulled the blinds down before settling into my sleeping bag. At some point in the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps crunching around my RV. My heart jumped into my throat as I strained to hear more. The footsteps stopped near the side of the vehicle, then slowly moved toward the front. I held my breath, my ears straining against the silence. Then, as quickly as they'd come, the footsteps retreated into the woods. I stayed awake for hours after that, every creak and rustle setting my nerves on edge. By morning, I convinced myself it had just been an animal. But part of me wasn't so sure. The morning after the footsteps incident, I tried to shake off the unease and go about my day as usual. The sun was out, the air was crisp, and I figured maybe I was just overreacting. But when I stepped outside, something immediately caught my attention: the fire pit. I always made sure to put my fires out completely before going to bed, but this morning there were fresh ashes scattered around, and the smell of burnt wood was stronger than it should have been. Someone had restarted the fire during the night. My stomach sank. "Morning," Cole's voice jolted me from my thoughts. He was walking toward my camp again, a coffee mug in hand. "Hey," I said, trying to sound normal. "Did you stop by here last night?" His eyebrows shot up. "Nope. Why do you ask?" I hesitated, debating whether to tell him about the footsteps. I thought I heard someone walking around, I said casually. He grinned. Probably just a deer or something. They get curious sometimes, especially if they smell food. Yeah, maybe, I mumbled, though I wasn't convinced. Cole didn't linger on the subject. Instead, he launched into another story about his travels. But I wasn't listening. My eyes kept darting to the edges of the woods, scanning for movement, half expecting someone, or something, to be watching us. Later that afternoon, while Cole and I were chatting by the creek, a middle-aged man walked by. He was staying at a nearby campsite and gave us a friendly wave before slowing down. "You two the ones in that RV over yonder?" he asked, gesturing toward my setup. "I am," I said. "Cole's camping just over the ridge." The man's expression shifted subtly, his smile fading. "Over the ridge, huh?" "Yeah," Cole replied, his tone suddenly sharper. "Is there a problem?" The man hesitated, then shook his head. No problem. Just thought I saw you walking around some of the other sites last night. Might want to be careful doing that. People get nervous out here." Cole chuckled, but it sounded forced. "Wasn't me. Must have been someone else." The man nodded slowly, then turned and walked away, but not before giving me a look I couldn't quite interpret. After he was out of earshot, Cole muttered, "People are so paranoid these days." I didn't respond. My mind was racing. If it wasn't Cole wandering around the campsites, who was it? And why was he suddenly defensive? Later that evening, I realized one of my hiking flashlights was missing. I always kept my gear in a specific spot, and there was no way I'd misplaced it. I mentioned it to Cole in passing, but he just shrugged. "Probably fell out of your bag on the hike," he said, avoiding eye contact. I wasn't so sure. As the sun set and shadows crept through the forest, the unease that had been simmering all day began to boil over. Something wasn't right, and I was starting to think it had everything to do with Cole. The next morning, I decided enough was enough. I wasn't about to sit around and pretend everything was fine. When Cole strolled over to my campsite like usual, I wasted no time. "Were you near my RV last night?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the accusation. "What? No, why would I do that?" "Someone was trying to get in," I said, crossing my arms. "If it wasn't you, then who?" Cole let out a short laugh. "Look, man, I get it. Being out here alone can mess with your head. Probably just some animal or the wind knocking a branch against your RV." His dismissive tone made my blood boil. "It wasn't the wind," I snapped. "I heard footsteps, Cole. Someone was out there." He shrugged, avoiding my gaze. "Well, it wasn't me." I wanted to press further, but something about the way he spoke made me stop. There was a coldness in his voice, a subtle warning not to push too hard. After Cole left, I decided to walk over to his campsite. I told myself I just wanted to clear the air, but really I was looking for answers. His campsite was little more than a small tent surrounded by scattered supplies. That's when I saw it, my missing flashlight, sitting on top of his backpack. I froze, my mind racing. I knew it was mine. It had the same red scratch on the side from when I dropped it on my last trip. I reached out and picked it up, feeling a mix of anger and fear. Why did he have it? Had he taken it when I wasn't looking? Worse, had he been the one lurking around my RV last night? I placed the flashlight back exactly where I found it and turned to leave, but something caught my eye. Sticking out of the side pocket of his backpack was a worn leather wallet. It wasn't just the wallet that made me pause, though. It was the driver's license visible through the clear plastic window. The name wasn't Cole, and the photo didn't look like him either. My stomach dropped as I stepped away, my mind spinning. Who the hell was this guy? And what else was he hiding? When I got back to my RV, I locked the door behind me and sat down, trying to piece everything together. The friendly camper I thought I'd met was clearly not who he said he was. He'd lied about his name, stolen my flashlight, and might have been the one outside my RV last night. The question now was, what was I going to do about it? I couldn't sit still. My gut was screaming that something wasn't right, and every time I thought about that wallet, the unease grew stronger. I needed answers. If Cole, or whoever he really was lying about something as basic as his name, what else could he be hiding? I decided to head to the ranger station about 2 miles away. It wasn't much, a small outpost meant to assist hikers and campers, but I figured if anyone could help me figure out who Cole really was, it'd be them. I told myself I'd play it cool, just ask about other campers in the area and see if anything unusual had been reported. As I walked, the forest seemed quieter than usual. Every crunch of leaves underfoot felt louder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but all I saw were trees swaying gently in the breeze. The ranger station came into view just as the clouds started to roll in, darkening the sky. Inside, a single ranger sat behind a desk, typing on an old computer. He looked up as I entered, his face lighting up with a friendly smile. "Afternoon," he. "What can I do for you?" I hesitated for a moment, unsure how to start. "Hey, I'm camped over near the creek," I began, trying to sound casual. "There's another guy out there, says his name's Cole. I was just wondering if you've seen him around or if you've had any trouble with campers recently." The ranger's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of curiosity. "Cole? Can't say I've met anyone by that name. What's he look like?" I described him. Sandy blonde hair, broad shoulders, friendly but with an edge. As I spoke, the ranger leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowing. "Doesn't ring a bell," he said finally. "But we don't keep tabs on every camper. You having issues with him?" I hesitated again, weighing my words carefully. "Not exactly. Just, he's been acting a little strange. I think he might have been snooping around my RV last night." The ranger straightened in his chair, his demeanor shifting. "Snooping around? You sure?" I nodded. "Pretty sure, and I think he might be using a fake name." The ranger frowned, tapping a pen against his desk. "Look, we get some drifters out here from time to time. Most are harmless, just passing through. But if you think this guy's up to something, you might want to move to a different site. Get some space between you two." The idea of packing up and leaving crossed my mind, but something in me resisted. This was my trip, my escape. Why should I be the one to leave? Still, the ranger's concern only deepened my own. "Just keep an eye on him," the ranger added. "And if anything else happens, let us know. We'll send someone out." As I left the station, the wind picked up, rustling the trees around me. The hike back to camp felt longer than it should have, and by the time I reached my RV, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't done with Cole yet. I couldn't stop replaying my conversation with the ranger as I sat in my RV later that afternoon. His suggestion to move campsites seemed reasonable, but something inside me resisted. It wasn't just stubbornness, I wanted answers. If Cole was up to something, leaving without knowing the truth felt wrong. That evening, I decided to keep my distance from him and focus on figuring things out. I pulled out my laptop, hoping to pick up a weak Wi-Fi signal from the ranger station I'd passed earlier. After several failed attempts, I managed to connect, though it was painfully slow. I started searching for anything that could link Cole, or whoever he really was, to something suspicious. At first, nothing came up. The name Cole was too vague, and I didn't have much else to go on. But then I remembered the wallet I'd seen at his campsite, the driver's license with a different name. I couldn't recall the exact name, but I remembered it started with James. I typed in James plus wanted fugitive into the search bar. The results loaded agonizingly slowly, but when they did, my stomach dropped. One of the top hits was a news article from a local Wyoming paper about a man named James Carlton. The headline read, "Man wanted for assault and robbery last seen in Yellowstone area." Asterisk, my heart pounded as I clicked on the article. The photo wasn't an exact match for Cole, but the resemblance was there. Same sandy blonde hair, same piercing eyes. According to the article, Carlton had been on the run for months after attacking a fellow hiker and stealing his belongings. He'd been spotted at various campsites across the region, but always managed to slip away before authorities could catch him. I leaned back in my chair, my hands trembling. Could this really be the same person? I stared at the screen, rereading the article to make sure I wasn't jumping to conclusions. The more I read, the more certain I became. Carlton had a pattern: befriend people at campsites, gain their trust, and then turn on them when they least expected it. I thought about how quickly Cole had approached me, how eager he'd been to join me on hikes and hang around my campsite. Was he setting me up to be his next victim? The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd been suspicious of Cole, sure, but I hadn't considered just how dangerous he might be. A loud knock on the side of my RV snapped me out of my thoughts. "Hey, Evan!" Cole's voice rang out cheerfully. "You in there?" My blood ran cold. I quickly shut my laptop and scrambled to compose myself. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to decide what to do. Should I confront him? Pretend everything was normal? Or stay silent and hope he went away? "Evan?" Cole called again, his voice closer now. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "Yeah, give me a minute," I called back, my voice shaky. I opened the RV door cautiously, trying to keep my expression neutral. Cole stood there with his usual easy grin, a flashlight in one hand and a bundle of kindling in the other. "Thought I'd check in," he said, holding up the wood. "Figured we could use this for the fire tonight." "Thanks," I replied, forcing a smile. "Appreciate it." He stepped closer, his eyes scanning my RV interior. "You've been holed up in here all afternoon. Everything okay?" "Yeah," I said quickly, "just catching up on some reading." He tilted his head slightly, his grin faltering for a fraction of a second. "You sure? You seem a little off." I felt a chill run down my spine. He was watching me carefully now, his piercing gaze making it hard to breathe. "Just tired," I said, brushing it off. "Didn't sleep great last night." That seemed to satisfy him, for now. He set the kindling down near the fire pit and gestured for me to join him. "Come on, let's get this going. It's gonna be a cold night." Reluctantly, I followed him outside. As we worked together to build the fire, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd read online. Every time he reached for more wood or adjusted the logs, I found myself watching his hands, half expecting him to grab something, a knife, a weapon. I kept telling myself to stay calm, not to let on that I knew anything. But every minute I spent near him felt like a gamble, like I was one wrong word away from setting him off. As the fire crackled to life, Cole leaned back in his chair, sipping from a can of beer. "So," he said, breaking the silence, "what's the plan tomorrow? Another hike?" I hesitated, not sure how to answer. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave at first light, but I knew he'd see that as suspicious. I couldn't risk tipping him off. "Maybe," I said casually, "or I might just hang around here. It's nice to relax for a change." He nodded, taking another sip. "Yeah, this spot's great. Quiet, out of the way." The way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. Out of the way. The conversation drifted to lighter topics after that, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept circling back to the photo from the article, to the driver's license I'd seen at his campsite. If this really was James Carlton, then sitting across from him right now was like sitting next to a ticking time bomb. As the fire began to die down, Cole stood up and stretched. "All right, I'm gonna call it a night," he said, flashing that same grin. "See you in the morning." I nodded, forcing a polite smile. "Good night." I watched him walk back toward his campsite, his flashlight bobbing in the darkness. The second he was out of sight, I bolted into my RV and locked the door. I locked the RV door and leaned against it, my chest rising and falling in short, rapid breaths. The reality of the situation hit me harder now that I was alone. If Cole, or James, or whoever he really was suspected I knew anything, I was in serious danger. I had to think fast. The article had mentioned that Carlton, if it really was him, always targeted campers in isolated areas. He would gain their trust and wait for the perfect moment to strike. I couldn't stop thinking about his casual friendliness, his constant presence at my campsite, and the missing flashlight I'd found in his tent. I pulled out my phone, but the signal was still non-existent. There was no way to call anyone for help. My only option was to get out of here as quickly as possible. I grabbed my keys and started packing up the essentials: my wallet, a flashlight, the knife I kept in the drawer, and a bottle of water. I threw them into my backpack and swung it over my shoulder, ready to start the RV and leave Cole behind. When I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered weakly but didn't start. No, I muttered, trying again. The engine groaned, but it wouldn't catch. My RV had been running perfectly fine the day before, and I'd checked the gas tank before heading out. It was full. A sick feeling crept over me. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone had tampered with it. I stepped out of the RV and circled around to the hood. Even in the dim light of my flashlight, I could see that something was wrong. Wires were hanging loose, cut cleanly, as if someone had taken a knife to them. Cole. The realization sent a surge of adrenaline through me. He'd sabotaged my vehicle, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere with no way to call for help. I had no idea when he'd done it. Maybe while I was asleep, or even while we were sitting around the fire. I backed away from the RV, scanning the dark woods around me. My flashlight beam danced over the trees, but there was no sign of him. The forest was unnervingly quiet. I retreated back into the RV, locking the door behind me again. My heart was pounding so loudly that it felt like it might give me away. If he was nearby. I crouched by the window, peering out through the blinds, my eyes darting between the shadows. A rustling sound came from the direction of Cole's campsite. My hand tightened around the knife as I strained to hear more. The noise grew louder, closer, until it was just outside my RV. The silence that followed was even worse. Then, a voice, low and calm, broke the stillness. "Evan," Cole called out, his tone almost playful. "You still up?" My blood turned cold as his voice echoed through the still night. He was standing just outside, somewhere near the front of the RV. My breathing was shallow, and my grip on the knife tightened until my knuckles turned white. "Evan," he said again, this time softer. "Come on, man! You in there?" I stayed silent, crouched low beneath the window. Every instinct told me not to respond. The sound of footsteps followed, slow and deliberate, circling the RV. Each crunch of gravel under his boots felt like a countdown. I could hear him tapping lightly on the side of the RV as he walked, as though he were toying with me. "I saw your light on earlier," he said. "Thought maybe we could talk. You seemed kinda stressed earlier. Everything okay?" I didn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. The footsteps stopped directly by the door. The handle jiggled once, then again, harder this time. I bit down on the urge to scream. You locked me out? He asked, his voice dropping slightly. That's not very neighborly of you. The handle rattled again, more forcefully. I scrambled back toward the Givlin's kitchen area, keeping as quiet as I could, and grabbed the second knife I kept in the drawer. You know, Cole continued, his voice calm but with a sinister edge, it's not safe out here on your own. You never know who you might run into. The way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't just a friendly camper checking in, he was taunting me. I heard a sharp crack outside, followed by the sound of something metallic hitting the ground. My heart sank as I realized what it was. He'd kicked over my folding chair, the one I'd left by the fire pit. Didn't take you for the paranoid type, Cole said, his tone now tinged with mockery. Locking your door, sitting in there all quiet. What's got you so spooked? I couldn't take it anymore. Gripping the knife tightly, I crawled back to the window and peeked through the blinds. His flashlight beam flickered across the campsite, illuminating the overturned chair and the dying embers of the fire. But he wasn't there. A wave of panic surged through me. Where had he gone? Suddenly, the sound of something heavy hit the side of the RV, making me jump. It was followed by a low chuckle. Evan, he said again, dragging out my name. You know, I've always liked camping with friends. Makes things interesting. I pressed my back against the wall, clutching the knife like it was my only lifeline. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Should I make a run for it? Wait him out? And then with a final chilling whisper, he said, I'll see. I sat frozen in place, trying to process his last words. I'll see you soon. My brain raced, flipping between panic and desperation as the silence outside dragged on. What was he planning? Was he still out there, waiting for me to make a move? Or was he already gone, watching from the shadows? I couldn't stay in the RV. It was a trap. Too small, too enclosed. If Cole decided to break in, I'd have nowhere to go. My only chance was to get out and find help, but doing that meant taking a massive risk. I grabbed my backpack and stuffed it with whatever I could find. A flashlight, a water bottle, my wallet, and the 2 knives I had. I slipped on my boots as quietly as I could, trying to calm my shaking hands. The thought of going out there, into the dark where Cole might be lurking, made my chest tighten, but staying here wasn't an option. I slid open one of the side windows just enough to peek out. The fire pit's embers still glowed faintly, but the rest of the campsite was pitch black. I waited, listening for any sound, footsteps, rustling, breathing, but there was nothing. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I pushed the window open further and climbed out. My boots hit the ground with a soft crunch. I crouched low, scanning the area with my flashlight off, relying only on the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. I had to move fast. The ranger station was my best bet for safety, but it was 2 miles away, and the trail there was narrow and overgrown. Still, I didn't hesitate. With my backpack slung over one shoulder and the knife gripped tightly in my hand, I started moving. The forest was eerily quiet, every step I took amplified by the stillness around me. Shadows loomed in the corners of my vision, twisting into shapes that made my heart race. I kept my flashlight off, relying on the moonlight and my memory of the trail. Every few steps I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see him following me. About 10 minutes into the hike, I heard it, a branch snapping somewhere behind me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Slowly I turned my head, straining to see through the darkness. At first there was nothing, just the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Then I saw it, a flicker of light, faint and bobbing, like someone moving with a flashlight. Cole. I ducked behind a tree, pressing my back against the rough bark as the light grew closer. I could hear my pulse thundering in my ears. Evan, his voice called out, soft but menacing. You can't hide forever. I gripped the knife tighter, my knuckles turning white. I had to keep moving, but every step I took felt like it would give me away. The hunt had begun. I stayed pressed against the tree, my chest heaving as I tried to keep my breathing quiet. The beam of Cole's flashlight swung through the darkness, cutting across the forest floor like a searchlight. I could hear his footsteps crunching on the dry leaves, slow and deliberate, as if he knew exactly how to draw out the tension. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he called, his voice carrying an edge of mockery. Come on, Evan, let's just talk. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but I knew I couldn't. If I made a break for it, he'd see me immediately. Instead, I crouched low and began moving carefully along the side of the trail, staying as close to the trees as possible. My boots barely made a sound as I stepped lightly on the damp earth. Cole's light swept past my hiding spot, missing me by inches. I gripped the knife tighter, the handle slick in my sweaty palm. My mind raced with plans: get to the ranger station, find a hiding spot, anything to get out of this nightmare. Do you even know where you're going? Cole called out again. His tone was calm, almost conversational, which somehow made it more terrifying. You can't get far in the dark. The forest has a way of swallowing people up. The sound of his footsteps grew louder, and I realized he was heading straight toward me. My heart hammered as I ducked behind another tree, trying to stay out of sight. The flashlight beam lit up the ground just a few feet away from where I crouched. Do you know what I hate most about this? Cole said, his voice closer now. The waiting. I'm not a patient guy, Evan. I bit down on the urge to scream as the light swept across my hiding spot. In that moment, I made a decision. I couldn't just keep running. If I wanted to survive, I had to outsmart him. Slowly, I reached into my backpack and pulled out my water bottle. With shaking hands, I unscrewed the cap, then threw it as hard as I could into the trees to my left. The sound of the bottle hitting branches and tumbling to the ground echoed through the forest. Cole's flashlight snapped toward the noise, and his footsteps followed. I took the opportunity to slip further down the fair trail, keeping low and moving quickly. My heart pounded as I put distance between us, but I knew I couldn't let my guard down. He was still out there, and he wouldn't stop until he found me. In the distance, I thought I saw a faint light. Maybe the ranger station. The hope gave me a surge of energy, but the thought was quickly drowned out by the sound of Cole's voice again, this time closer than I expected. You're clever, Evan, he called. But not clever enough. I kept moving, my legs aching as I darted between trees, staying off the trail as much as I could. My breath came in short, uneven gasps, but I forced myself to stay quiet. The faint light in the distance, the one I thought might be the ranger station, became my only focus. It flickered through the trees, just barely visible, but it was enough to keep me going. Behind me, Cole's flashlight cut through the forest, the beam bouncing erratically as he moved. His footsteps had picked up pace, crunching louder, more determined. You think you can get away from me? He yelled, his voice sharper now. You're only making this worse for yourself. I ducked low behind a thick cluster of bushes, crouching so my knees almost buckled under me. My ears strained to pick up every sound, his footsteps, the rustle of leaves, the way his voice carried through the stillness of the forest. Evan, he shouted again, the anger in his voice barely contained. You're wasting my time. I clutched the knife tighter, my mind racing. If he got too close, I'd have no choice but to defend myself, but the idea of facing him head-on was terrifying. He was bigger, stronger, and clearly more experienced in situations like this. I needed a distraction. My hand brushed against a rock on the ground, and an idea struck me. Carefully, I picked it up, weighing it in my palm. Then, with all the strength I could muster, I hurled it toward a distant tree. the rock hit the trunk with a sharp crack, echoing through the forest. Cole's flashlight beam swung in that direction, and I heard his footsteps shift as he moved toward the sound. I didn't waste a second. I rose from my hiding spot and bolted toward the light in the distance. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. The faint glow ahead grew brighter, and I realized with a surge of relief that it was a building. A small cabin, likely part of the ranger station. I stumbled toward it, the wooden structure coming into view. My hand reached for the door, and to my immense relief, it opened without resistance. I slammed it shut behind me and quickly slid the heavy bolt lock into place. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, with only a small table and chair in the center of the room. My flashlight illuminated a dusty radio on the table. I rushed over, my fingers fumbling as I tried to switch it on. The static-filled crackle that followed was both a relief and a frustration. It was working, but barely. I grabbed the mic and pressed the button. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "Is anyone there? I need help. Someone is after me." The static hissed back at me, and I fought the urge to scream. Outside, I heard Cole's voice again, louder this time. "I know you're in there, Evan," he taunted. "You can't hide forever." Cole's voice sent a jolt of terror through me. He was close, far too close. I dropped the radio mic, scanning the dimly lit cabin for anything I could use to defend myself. My flashlight's beam darted over the dusty table, an old chair, and some rusted tools hanging on the wall. I grabbed the heaviest item I could find, a rusted fire axe, and positioned myself near the door. The cabin was small, barely more than a single room. There were no windows large enough to climb through, and no back door to escape. If Cole got inside, it would be a fight to the death. His footsteps crunched on the gravel outside, slow and deliberate. He wasn't rushing. He knew he had me cornered. "Smart move, Evan," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "But you can't just lock yourself away forever. Sooner or later you'll have to come out." I held my breath, my heart hammering in my chest as his footsteps circled the cabin. The sound stopped near the door, and the handle jiggled once, then twice. "Locked?" he said with an exaggerated sigh. "You're really making this hard for me." The door shuddered as he kicked it, the force making me jump. I tightened my grip on the axe, positioning myself just out of view from the doorway. "Here's the deal, Evan," he said, his voice calm but menacing. "You open this door, and we talk. That's all I want. Just a little chat. Or, I can break it down. Your choice." I stayed silent, praying he'd think I'd already escaped. But the next thing I heard made my stomach drop, the unmistakable sound of something metallic scraping against the door. A knife. He was trying to pry it open. Panic surged through me. My eyes darted around the room, looking for anything else that might buy me time. In the corner I noticed a stack of old firewood. An idea hit me, desperate but better than nothing. I quietly grabbed a few pieces and stacked them against the door, wedging them tightly under the handle to reinforce the lock. It wouldn't hold forever, but it might slow him down. Outside, Cole chuckled. "Oh, come on, don't make me work for it, Evan. You know I'll get in eventually." The scraping stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. I strained to hear any sound, my body tense and ready to swing the axe. Then, with a deafening crash, the door splintered. The lock held for a moment before giving way, and the wood I'd stacked shifted as the door cracked open. Cole's face appeared in the gap, his expression twisted into a smug grin. "Found you." I didn't wait. With every ounce of strength I had, I swung the axe toward the door. The axe struck the edge of the door with a sickening crack, splinters flying everywhere. Cole cursed and stumbled back, his flashlight tumbling to the ground. I didn't waste a second. I yanked the axe free and positioned myself for another swing. Whoa, whoa! Cole's voice carried a mix of amusement and irritation. Easy there, Evan. We're just talking, remember? Stay back. I shouted, my voice trembling but firm. I swear I'll use this. For a moment, he stayed just beyond the shattered doorway, his figure silhouetted by the moonlight. He wasn't afraid. I could see it in the way he held himself, calm and calculated. This was a game to him, and he was enjoying it. You've got some fight in you, he said, chuckling softly. I like that. Makes things interesting. My heart raced as I tried to think of what to do next. I couldn't stay in the cabin much longer. The door was already half broken, and Cole wasn't the type to give up. I needed an exit, a way to escape before he forced his way in. He took a step closer, his hand gripping the edge of the splintered doorframe. Come on, Evan, he said, his tone almost playful. Let's not drag this out. We both know how it ends. I raised the axe again, ready to swing if he came any closer. I'm not letting you in, he smirked. Oh, you'll let me in. Eventually. Suddenly he lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the door and yanking it open with a burst of strength. I swung the axe instinctively, the blade narrowly missing him as he jumped back, laughing. You're getting sloppy, he taunted. The taunt made my blood boil. I couldn't let him intimidate me. Not now, not when survival was my only option. With the door wide open and nothing left to hold him back, I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed one of the wooden logs I'd used to block the door and hurled it at him. The log struck his arm, and he let out a sharp grunt of pain, dropping the knife he'd been holding. I didn't wait to see his reaction. I bolted out of the cabin, the axe still in my hand, and sprinted toward the trail. My legs burned, and every breath felt like fire in my chest. But I didn't stop. Behind me, I heard him recovering, his heavy footsteps pounding the ground as he gave chase. You're just making this worse for yourself, he shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. I didn't look back. The trail twisted and turned through the dense forest, and I forced myself to keep moving, the axe weighing heavily in my hand. I had no idea where I was going, only that I had to stay ahead of him. The trees closed in around me, the forest growing darker and more oppressive with each passing second. But I couldn't stop now, not when my life depended on it. Branches tore at my face and arms as I sprinted through the dense forest. The darkness felt alive, the shadows shifting with every step I took. My lungs burned, and my legs screamed for relief, but I couldn't stop. I could hear Cole behind me, his footsteps crashing through the underbrush like a predator closing in on its prey. Evan, he shouted, his voice laced with frustration and glee. You can't outrun me. Just give it up. I clutched the axe tighter, the wooden handle slippery in my sweaty grip. Every few seconds I glanced back, expecting to see him lunging out of the darkness. Instead, I saw flickers of his flashlight bouncing erratically, the beam growing closer. A root snagged my boot, and I stumbled, barely catching myself before hitting the ground. My heart raced as I scrambled back to my feet, the sound of Cole's pursuit growing louder. The trail I had been following seemed to disappear, swallowed by the forest. I had no idea where I was going, only that I had to keep moving. I pushed through a thick patch of bushes, the branches scratching at my skin, and stumbled into a small clearing. There. In the center of the clearing was an old, weathered shack. The wood was rotting, the roof sagging under years of neglect, but it was shelter. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I dashed toward the shack, throwing my shoulder against a warped door. It groaned loudly but gave way, and I stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. The shack was empty except for a few rusted tools hanging on the walls and a broken chair lying in the corner. The air was damp and smelled of mildew, but it was better than being out in the open. I shoved a heavy wooden beam against the door, wedging it under the handle as a makeshift barricade. Outside, the forest was eerily silent. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear any sign of Cole. At first there was nothing. No footsteps, no rustling leaves. Then, faintly, I heard it. The slow, deliberate crunch of boots on the ground. My heart sank as the sound grew louder, closer. He was here. I tightened my grip on the axe, positioning myself in the shadows near the door. If he came inside, I would have to fight. There was no other choice. "Evan," Cole called out, his voice calm and unsettling. "You're running out of places to hide." The footsteps stopped just outside the shack. I held my breath, my knuckles white as I gripped the axe. The door creaked slightly under his weight, and I could see the faint beam of his flashlight through the cracks in the wood. "You really thought this would stop me?" he said, almost laughing. The door shuddered as he slammed his shoulder against it. The door rattled violently under Cole's weight, each blow sending splinters flying into the darkened shack. I pressed myself against the far wall, clutching the axe as tightly as I could, my pulse pounding in my ears. Every muscle in my body screamed for action, but I stayed rooted in place, waiting for the inevitable. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Evan," he shouted, his voice laced with both anger and amusement. "Come on, let's end this already." Another crash, and the door gave way. The wooden beam I had wedged under the handle splintered, and the door swung open with a loud bang. Cole stepped inside, his flashlight casting long, eerie shadows across the cramped space. His face was partially illuminated, twisted into a smug grin. "There you are," he said softly, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. I didn't wait for him to make the first move. With a yell that was more fear than courage, I swung the axe as hard as I could. The blade caught him on the shoulder, not deep but enough to send him staggering back with a grunt of pain. "You little," he snarled, clutching his arm. His flashlight fell to the floor, rolling and casting erratic beams of light around the shack. I didn't stop. I swung again, this time aiming lower, and managed to knock him off balance. He hit the ground hard, but before I could follow up, he lashed out with his boot, catching me square in the ribs. The force knocked me backward, the axe slipping from my grip. I hit the wall, gasping for air as pain shot through my chest. Cole was already scrambling to his feet, blood dripping from his shoulder. "You think you can take me?" he growled, grabbing the axe. "You've got guts, I'll give you that." He raised the axe, and for a split second, I thought it was over. But just as he stepped forward, his injured arm gave out, and the axe slipped from his grasp. It hit the floor with a dull thud. I didn't hesitate. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I lunged at him, tackling him to the ground. We grappled in the dirt, his hands clawing at my face while I struggled to pin him down. My hand brushed against something cold and metallic, the flashlight. Without thinking, I grabbed it and swung it at his head as hard as I could. The impact sent him sprawling, his body going limp beneath me. I scrambled to my feet, breathing heavily as I stared down at him. His chest rose and fell weakly, but he didn't move. I didn't wait to see if he'd recover. I grabbed the axe, bolted out of the shack, and ran as fast as I could. The forest was still dark and oppressive, but I didn't care. I had to get out of there. The Rangers didn't waste any time. As soon as they pieced together that the man chasing me matched the description of James Carlton, the wanted fugitive, they called for backup. Their voices were calm and steady as they spoke into their radios, but I could see the tension in their faces. The male ranger turned to me after finishing his call. "You're lucky you made it out," he said, his voice low. "If it really is Carlton, he's been on the run for a while, and he's dangerous." I nodded, but my throat felt too tight to speak. My body was still trembling, the adrenaline that had carried me this far fading fast. I sat on a worn bench in the corner of the ranger station, gripping the water bottle they'd given me like it was the only solid thing in the room. The female ranger sat across from me, her expression serious but kind. "We need as much information as you can give us," she said. "Anything you remember about him, how he acted, what he said, where he might be now." I swallowed hard and started talking. I told them about meeting Cole, or James, at my campsite, about how he seemed friendly at first but quickly grew suspicious. I described the sabotage to my RV, the footsteps outside at night, and how he had chased me through the woods. "And the shack?" the male ranger asked. "What happened there?" I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the water bottle. I think I knocked him out," I said quietly. "But I don't know if he's still there. He could have followed me." The female ranger exchanged a look with her partner. "We'll send a team out to search the area," she said. "For now, you're safe here." Safe. The word felt foreign, almost meaningless. Even with two rangers sitting in front of me, the solid walls of the station around us, and the promise of help on the way, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. "What if he—" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The male ranger gave me a reassuring nod. "He'd be a fool to try. Backup's on its way and we'll stay armed and alert." I nodded, trying to believe him, but my nerves were frayed. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see his shadow moving through the trees. The faint sound of engines in the distance broke the silence. A few minutes later, two more rangers arrived, their vehicles crunching over the gravel outside. They were armed and ready, their faces serious as they listened to the situation. "We'll start at the shack and fan out from there," one of them said. The female ranger stayed behind with me while the others prepared to leave. "You did the right thing coming here," she said, her voice steady. "You'll get through this." I nodded again, but the weight of everything that had happened was crushing me. The forest began to thin as I ran, the oppressive shadows giving way to the faint light of dawn breaking over the horizon. My legs burned, my chest heaved, but the thought of stopping never crossed my mind. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent adrenaline surging through me. The fear of hearing Cole's voice behind me driving me forward. When I finally spotted the ranger station in the distance, a wave of relief so powerful it nearly knocked me over washed through me. The small building was illuminated by the weak early light, its windows glowing faintly. I stumbled toward it, my vision swimming from exhaustion and the adrenaline crash hitting me all at once. I slammed my fist against the door, shouting hoarsely, "Help! Someone, please!" The door opened abruptly, and a ranger appeared, his face a mixture of surprise and concern. "What happened? Are you hurt?" I could barely get the words out. There's a man in the woods," I gasped, clutching my ribs. "He attacked me. He's still out there." The ranger grabbed me by the arm, steadying me as I nearly collapsed. "Come inside," he said, his tone urgent. "We'll call for backup." Inside, the warmth of the small building was jarring after the cold forest. Another ranger, a woman, joined us as I collapsed into a chair. They handed me a water bottle, and I took small, shaky sips, my hands trembling. "Tell us what happened," the woman said, her voice calm but firm. I told them everything, or as much as I could between gasping breaths. I described Cole, his stalking, how he'd sabotaged my RV, and the final confrontation in the shack. Their faces grew more serious with every detail, and the male ranger exchanged a grim look with his partner. "That matches the description," he muttered. What description? I asked, my voice rising with panic. The woman turned to me, her expression grave. We got a bulletin a few days ago about a fugitive in the area. James Carlton. He's been on the run for months. Violent, dangerous. It sounds like your friend might be him. The room seemed to tilt as her words sank in. I'd been right. Cole wasn't just some drifter. He was a wanted criminal, and I'd barely escaped with my life. Is he still out there? I asked, my voice whisper. The male ranger nodded grimly. We'll send out a search team, but if he's as resourceful as the reports say, he won't be easy to track. The weight of their words pressed down on me. Even though I was safe now, the thought of Cole, or James, or whatever his name was, still being out there made my skin crawl. Just stay here for now, the woman said gently. We'll take it from here. I nodded, clutching the water bottle like it was the only thing anchoring me to reality. Even now, I wonder how close I came to not making it out alive. Meeting Cole changed my life forever, and not in the way I hoped this trip would. Be careful who you trust, especially when you're alone in the wilderness. Have you ever had a terrifying encounter while traveling or camping? Share your story in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real-life horror stories. Stay safe out there.